years have been about sort of more the ordinary people.
That's right.
I interviewed a lady. She'd written almost like a travel logbook about sort of going through Germany in the Third Reich. And then she wrote a second one about effectively a biography of a village in Bavaria during the Third Reich. Absolutely fascinating.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
You've concentrated sort of at the top end, I suppose.
Not so much, Ian. I mean, see, this book is kind of modelled on a book that came out in 1971 by the German journalist and historian Joachim Fest called The Face of the Third Reich. And that's why I gave it my book, the subtitle, Faces of the Third Reich. And so I followed the model a bit. So there's a biographical essay on Hitler first, and then I go down through the second part is what I call paladins, that is to say, the main people in the regime. And then the third section is about kind of the instruments of rule, people who didn't really shape policy, but certainly did a huge amount to carry it out. And then finally, the bottom level, as I said, like ordinary mass murderers, sympathisers, fellow travellers, and the like. So I do try and cover all these areas.
And that's the leading historian of the Third Reich, Professor Sir Richard J. Evans, also my history tutor at university, a wonderful man. And you can hear our full conversation by subscribing to the Iain Dale All Talk podcast on Global Player. Well, coming up in a moment, it's Wednesday's edition of Cross Question. I'm joined on the panel by Esther McVey, the former Cabinet Minister and Conservative MP for Tatton. Rachael Maskell is Labour MP for York Central. Zoë Grünewald is a political journalist. He's the Westminster editor of the website The Lead. And Sarah Southern is a political commentator, former advisor to David Cameron. They're here to answer your questions on 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 and you can watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the government will review targets on electric vehicle sales after Vauxhall revealed plans to close its plant in Luton. The firm partly blamed stringent zero emissions targets. It's feared the investment needed to meet quotas set by the Tories is costing jobs. Motoring journalist Quentin Wilson says it's a tough balancing act.
China sold 1.7 million electric cars in a single month in September. So if we put our heads in the sand and say we're not going to do this, then we'll simply get left behind. But we have to protect our motor industry.
The former boss of the hospital where Lucy Letby murdered 7 babies and attempted to kill 7 others has apologised to victims' families. It's after suspicions were directly raised to him. But Tony Chambers has told the inquiry the failure to identify what was happening sooner wasn't a personal one. British troops could support Lebanese armed forces to secure the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. The truce has so far held and is due to last for 60 days. And a seaside attraction in Brighton, which owes £51 million to the City Council, has filed for insolvency. Managers of the I-360 observation tower have called in administrators blaming escalating costs, bad summer weather and the cost of living crisis. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed up 16 points at 82.74. The pound buys $1.26 and €1.19. LBC weather, dry and cold for most tonight, windy in the southeast and a low of -3. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. I'm Iain Dale. Welcome to Cross Question, your chance to question a panel on any issue that you like. Joining me on the panel tonight, to my left, Rachael Maskell, Labour MP for York Central. Next to her, Esther McVey, the Conservative former Cabinet Minister. She's MP for Tatton. Survived the deluge, didn't you?
Absolutely.
Unlike many. Zoë Grünewald, to my right, is a political journalist. He's the Westminster editor of the website The Lead. And Sarah Southern is a political commentator who is an advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister and does stand-up comedy as well. Been a veteran of the Edinburgh Fringe, a bit like myself. Right, let's tell you how you can get in touch with us if you'd like to put a question to the panel. 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number or you can text 84850. Say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC and, of course, watch us on Global Player.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's start off with a WhatsApp question from Nikki in Kent. Stellantis, the company that runs Vauxhall's factory in Luton, blames Westminster's zero-emissions vehicle mandate for the closure of the Luton site. However, the press and commentators failed to mention that Stellantis already said that 1,500 jobs could be put in jeopardy if part of the Brexit treaty is not renegotiated, as with 70% of vans, which will now be made in France, exported into mainland Europe, tariffs risk the company's competitiveness. How much did Brexit play a part in these job losses? Esther McVey.
Well, if they had have, I'm quite sure you would have seen them earlier. So what you're saying now is, and it is a net zero zealotry. It is a Labour Party that is sacrificing the jobs of the working class on something which is an obsession, I would say, particularly for Ed Miliband and the rest of the Labour Party. It doesn't make sense, and as it's coming to the crunch hour, people and industries and businesses are saying it. I will also say the Tory Party didn't necessarily cover itself in glory as it started down this path.
I was about to point that out.
But what I will say is Rishi did start dismantling the most potent effects of that. And, and as I said, as the day gets closer, people realise what madness it is. All you're doing is exporting jobs abroad and impoverishing your own country. And I wish Labour would row back on this.
But can you seriously say that Brexit has had no part in this?
I think it would be very difficult to separate out what happened with lockdown and COVID and the absolute devastating effects that happened. And we never did, in my mind, as a Brexiteer, conclude half of the deals we should have done, because we moved straight off from Brexit and all the negotiations into basically 2 years of lockdown. Now, we have seen since then trade deals right around the world. But really, if it had have been that, like I said, it would have started earlier. It really isn't. It is about this net zero zealotry. It is about forcing cars or vans on people that they don't want. And now this ludicrous fines for businesses, £15,000 a van and a car if you don't meet these ridiculous targets by January next year.
But if these vans are now going to be made in France, that surely would lend weight to the argument that there must be some Brexit involvement in this decision.
I don't think France has got the same penalties that they're imposing on the car industry. I think you'll find a lot of Europe, particularly Germany, are already rowing back whilst we are steaming forward on our net zero targets.
OK, Rachael, Maskell?
Well, first of all, I have to say it's a devastating day for Luton when we think that the Vauxhall's been there 120 years. Generations of families have worked at the plant. And of course, today is their day when we've got to think about the impact that this is having on the community and individuals. But of course, we've heard from the trade union, which is going to obviously fight for those jobs, and it's absolutely right that they do, but we've got to look at the reasons why. I mean, we may be talking about Brexit being in history, but of course we are still feeling the impact of that. Many companies themselves have held the line for as long as they can, but quite frankly, the higher tariffs are breaking those companies, and they've made very difficult decisions. And that's why I say to Stellantis and other companies that they really do now need to think about the opportunities that Labour will create and to negotiate with governments. These are good quality jobs, good quality manufacturing jobs, and we've got to hold on to those. When it comes to looking at the transition that this government are making into a greener, cleaner future, what's important to recognise is that we've got our responsibility to do that. The whole world is shifting, and quite frankly, we can't be left behind in that. Now, of course, if you're manufacturing vehicles in France or you're manufacturing vehicles in the UK, the difference is the location as opposed to the product. And that's why I think Esther's argument falls apart, because this is ultimately about those tariffs as opposed to the product which is being produced, which will remain the same.
Sarah Southern.
I'm very pro EVs. I think electric vehicles are a really positive thing. I would have hoped that the UK could have become a real champion of this form of manufacturing. It's a shame, a real tragedy for Luton that they're losing all these jobs. But I do think a lot of industries are going to get to a point where they want all of their fleet vehicles to be electric. And once the grid is better, to be able to charge the batteries faster, more points in which to do it, I think a lot of people will do that. Fuel is not going to get any cheaper, but although the outlay of electric vehicles at the moment is higher, the cost of running them is significantly lower, and many businesses are looking at ways that they can cut costs, and this is a great way of doing it.
Sorry.
I think we're seeing the impact of Brexit across the economy on many different industries. You know, we've been talking about farming a lot recently. I mean, the impact of Brexit on farming has been disastrous. Fisheries, hospitality, and now, of course, this as well. So I think it's impossible to detangle any of these things. And I think when Labour does do its industrial strategy, it needs to look carefully at what Brexit has done to the economy and where the government can fill in those gaps. I think, you know, Esther said that Rishi Sunak did, good thing in trying to undo what she called, the zealotry around net zero. I mean, I would disagree. I think he's made things terribly worse. I mean, businesses take their cue from government on investment, on encouragement, on confidence in these industries. And if you have a net zero agenda, which I think is good, I'm a big fan of electric vehicles as well, but then you row back on it, that doesn't instill business with confidence. They don't proceed, they can't proceed with their plans. And that now they are suffering from a lack of investment, innovation. The government needs to, if they're going to pursue net zero, they need to go full steam ahead. And I think what has happened has actually really badly damaged confidence, and that sets us back. The rest of the world, as Sarah said, is investing in net zero. They want to see technologies without, reliance on fuel, and what we've done is disastrous.
So that's why under Rishi Sunak, our growth was the best in the G7. It's now collapsed under Labour. As he was winding things back, we were getting investment into the UK. Now, do you all have electric cars? You seem to be espousing the virtues. Do you have one?
I don't drive.
Don't you?
Well,
don't drive.
No.
I live in London.
You don't drive, but I would get one.
I did, but I gave it back. Went back to the...
So what I'm saying is I'm listening to a lot of people pontificating about the wonders of electric vehicles. None of you have one. I did try for a little while.
But we use electric buses.
I didn't find it cheaper, actually. So it's quite interesting that necessarily isn't the case. And it wasn't cheaper to buy. So this is what I'm talking about. The political class not being in touch with the working person who is buying, paying for those cars, upkeeping and using them on a daily basis. Not people telling people what they are doing, even though they haven't even bought one or even drive. Unbelievable.
Well, I disagree. I mean, I think I have my parents use an electric car. They love their electric car. London has plenty of hybrid vehicles. We use electric buses. It's not true that I've never set foot in an electric car.
And London is quite different to maybe the rural areas, maybe to the regions. It's very different altogether. But I'm just pointing out the hypocrisy of this audience espousing electric vehicles, and you neither have one, have bought one, or drive one.
Well, the reason I don't have one is that I made a very clear decision that I would use public transport, and I cycle and walk around my constituency. So mine was a positive environmental choice as to not to have a car.
So a small company that needs one to get its goods from A to B, a white van driver, anybody who's like a single person trader does need it and cannot get a bus from A to B to do their deliveries
and
or
that's
put them
why
on a bike.
it's really important that we invest in our manufacturing, because when you build the capacity of the market, when you have the infrastructure in place, then it brings down the cost for
and when
for
you
people.
do, you can pursue your dreams and you can put your fines on people, and that isn't there yet. So what you've allowed is the talk of technology to actually outpace the realism and the infrastructure in the country, and that is the problem.
And we have to look to your government why we don't have that infrastructure in place, because we know consistently they didn't even meet their targets on that. So
it was people power who didn't actually want these vehicles.
No, the government set an ambition around infrastructure, and it fell well short of that, and that's why the confidence fell out of the market. And of course, Labour is now putting that in place, building the confidence, and wants to see the investment in our in manufacturing as well. So it will
work
come
out the
together.
cost of an electric car, and when you've got one, come back to us and the rest of the people who are choosing not to buy them.
It is an interesting point, isn't it, that over the last few years, the incentives to buy electric cars have diminished. And sales, it is true, we did an hour on this last week, and although newspaper reports about Ford cutting jobs and factories because, in the words of the newspaper, the floor is falling out of the electric car market. Actually, it's not quite true. That the sales of electric cars are still increasing, just not at a very fast rate. So I think 23% of cars sold now are electric. But the targets, Sarah Southern, that the government have put on manufacturers or on the retailers to sell a proportion of electric cars are getting to be unrealistic, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the government, though, has to be ambitious in its targets to ensure that they get close to it.
They still have to be realistic.
True, but I do.
You can't force people to buy a car that they don't want to buy.
No, and I don't think anyone should be forced to. But I think what I'm noticing at the moment is friends who do have cars, who do drive, unlike me, are having the discussion now. I know of a business that are looking as to whether they could change the fleet to an electric vehicle fleet. They're not going to do it immediately, but the fact that those conversations are happening, I think, is a positive thing. I've just come back from the States. I was amazed that all of my friends that I stayed with, they would have two cars, one which was kind of a run-of-the-mill petrol car, and the other was electric. And I thought it was really interesting across the board. Everybody had an electric car.
You obviously have very rich friends.
Well,
I mean,
I think you have to be in the States at the minute.
That's what I would like to do.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to buy an electric car just as a sort of runabout to go to the station in.
And that's probably what they were doing. If you asked them why they had one and the other one was more reliable, easier to fill up, and could go for longer distances.
Exactly.
You're okay putting the radio on and the windscreen wipers on and the heating on, and it wouldn't give up. That's why they had two, and the electric one was for a little run round because they had the money.
I did find it interesting that some of them enjoyed it because there was also self-drive mode on the car at times, and they liked that aspect of it.
I'll never have a car that wants to drive itself. Now, Esther, you might be surprised to know that you're dividing opinion.
Oh, good.
Yes. Some people are saying you're exposing the hypocrisy of the woke liberal left, and others are saying that they can't listen to you because you've been obnoxious to other panellists.
Oh, there you go. But I think the exposing of the hypocrisy of the liberal left is what I aimed to do.
Well,
and that's what you've got on the panel. So I think that's probably right.
We'll see what the other three can expose. No, I won't say that. Over the next 45 minutes, it's 8:15.
This is LBC.
Finance.
Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
16 minutes past 8, we have Conservative MP Esther McVey, Labour MP Rachael Maskell, Zoë Grünewald, a political journalist from the Lead website, and what's the domain name so people can have a look at it?
The Lead UK.
Very easy. And Sarah Southern, political commentator. They're here answering your questions. Right, Mike is in Finchley. Hello, Mike.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. So the question to the panel is, how should the Lebanese people feel now that Hezbollah, the Islamic terror group, has been occupying Lebanon and is now been severely downgraded by Israel?
Zoe?
Well, I think the people of Lebanon will be pleased that there will be an end to that there is a ceasefire and there is an end to the immediate conflict in the region. You know, people are returning home. I think they will be grateful to see that hopefully this peace deal that has finally been brokered is designed at least to hopefully last the distance, and I think they'll be pleased about that. Obviously, there are still concerns. I mean, there are questions now about whether a similar ceasefire can be brokered in Gaza. That's a different, thornier issue, and I think there's lots and lots of concern about that. There's also concern about whether either side side will maintain the deals of a ceasefire. But I think for now we need to be hopeful that this conflict might be beginning to come to an end, because what we have seen over the past year has been truly appalling, and so much life lost, and so much instability in the region, and it was spreading. So I think for now we should be happy and grateful that a ceasefire has been brokered.
And if we look at it from the perspective purely of ordinary Lebanese people, Sarah Southern, I mean, they've gone through a pretty hard time over the last few decades, let alone the last few years since that terrible explosion in Beirut. And they were just sort of getting themselves back on the feet, and then this conflict breaks out. It must be quite difficult if you're an ordinary Lebanese person to be optimistic about anything.
Absolutely, and
it's the most fantastic country as well.
Absolutely, and I'm sure we've all got Lebanese friends, and being concerned about their families back home. It is a very stressful time and an uncomfortable time for the Lebanese people. But I do hope that we kind of take a level of optimism and hope from this ceasefire, and if that level of optimism and hope could perhaps spread across the region and we get to a point of peace there, I think that's what we would all like. But it's quite difficult to feel that when we've seen the level of violence over the last year and a half and across the decades. But I just hope that we can get to a point where ceasefires are holding and lead to firm peace deals across that region.
And Rachael, it's interesting that Mike there, he says, should the Lebanese people, how should they feel about the fact that Hezbollah has been severely downgraded? Well, I mean, Hezbollah had got quite a grip on Lebanon, hadn't it? And so from that point of view, there ought to be a degree of optimism.
Well, obviously, it sits within government, within Lebanon, as well as obviously has this military arm as well. And I think the fact that the military side has been put in a box gives the region greater security. And we've got to welcome the agreement that's being put in place. And we've got to ensure that it holds. And I think the way that the security forces can be moved south is going to be incredibly helpful in bringing, de-escalating that risk. But we have got to learn that nearly 4,000 people have lost their lives in that region, families been devastated. Rebuilding the infrastructure is going to take a significant amount of resource and attention. And I trust that the communities across Lebanon will be able to be part of that rebuilding. But I think there is a very strong message that, first of all, deals can be broke, which is really important. But secondly, is that there does need to be a de-escalation of terrorist groups in the region. And that is the most challenging thing when we then turn to our eyes to look at what's happening across Palestine and Israel, when we think about Hamas, and it has now got to come to the table. And that is the challenge which the world is now focused on, to try and see that we can see the de-escalation of the most catastrophic situation that anyone can witness.
And what about Iran's role in this? Because they must have been consulted by Hezbollah to come to this decision. I mean, has it weakened Iran, do you think?
Well, of course, the geopolitics are changing at the moment. I mean, people will obviously be looking to what's happening in the US in January and recognising that those tectonic plates are on the move. And as a result, people will be thinking about that long-term future, but also we've got to start building stability, and I think we've got to create a foreign policy which is on the front foot and a step ahead, and it feels like for some time it's been on the back foot, and that is no way in which to try and be a kind of a leader in these very, very challenging situations.
Esther.
For the first time when I heard that this deal had been brokered, I actually felt a little bit of hope. And I thought, if this can be the start, and I think we're all in accord here, that it could maybe move into the Gaza region, I just felt that the war is so horrific. There's been death and destruction on everybody's side. Nobody is a winner in war. And I just thought this could be the start. So as I said, for the first time in a long time, I thought we might be on a path to peace.
A lot of people are thinking, well, if there can be a ceasefire with Hezbollah, why not Hamas as well? What's the hurdle there? Is it purely the word hostage?
Look, I don't know. I feel it's very, very deep-rooted, very, very complicated. There seems to be grievance on top of grievance going on for many, many years. There is a bit that both is going to have to stand down and maybe concede a loss here, a loss there, because the greater victory is peace for the whole region. And I feel every citizen has unnecessarily borne the wars of history. And I think we've got to look to the future. And every time I hear negotiations on this, they go back 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. And actually, they do need to move forward.
Amazing. We've had consensus on the conflict in the Middle East. Never thought that would happen.
See, they need us round that table.
Well, quite. Harold says, the government recently said David Lammy will be Foreign Secretary. Well, the Prime Minister said recently that David Lammy will be Foreign Secretary for the rest of this Parliament. But if the Chagos deal collapses, how on earth can he stay in post? We were talking about this in the last hour of the programme. A really thorny issue, because if a government comes to an agreement, they trumpet it as a diplomatic coup, and then suddenly a new government in Mauritius calls it into question, and the new government in the United States calls it into question. Sarah Southern, let's start with you on this. If it does collapse, the Foreign Secretary would have a lot of egg on his face, wouldn't he?
I think he will, but I don't think it'll lead to him losing his job. It's a strange one, this, because obviously it came to the forefront when the new Labour government came in, and I think it was quite unexpected that it was happening, and then it got so much coverage. Obviously, then the US have said that they're not keen, and I thought, well, that might lead to a change. And then the new government in Mauritius not being keen, I would say, is perhaps the final nail in the coffin, because they do have to have a say in what they want to do with the Chagos Islands. So I would be interested to see what happens in the next 48 hours with this. But I don't think it should necessarily lead to a change in Foreign Secretary. I just think it was perhaps not the right issue to be tackling in the early part of this new government.
Rachael.
Well, we've got to remember that there's been 12 negotiations under the last government to try and address the Chagos Islands. So this isn't a new issue by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, the negotiations which have led to this deal also started under the last government. So Labour were concluding that deal along those lines. And of course, it did get the support not only in the US and on the basis of national security, but I know one of the big issues has been particularly around being able to have the base there, and that has been part of the treaty. Now, obviously, like any treaty, it's going to have to go before governments and to get the sign-off. And I think in particular, obviously a new government coming in Mauritius, it's got its cabinet meeting on Friday morning. It will be discussing this issue. We've got to wait to see the real detail of the deal, but also the response to it. Is this an end of a deal, or is it a start of embedding a negotiation and building the parties around it? And we don't know that at this point.
Esther?
A deal signed in haste and regretted in leisure. And I think you have to say, why was it signed so hastily? It was in the closing days of the Chagos government. It was in the opening days of a Labour government. And I also think it was a strategic mistake and a bad decision by Keir Starmer, who obviously thought that Biden was going to remain in power. And actually, or I should say Kamala Harris was, and they got it completely wrong. And now they're trying to have to unstitch what they did. I know equally they don't want to show Parliament the negotiation deal. We don't actually know what they've signed away. We don't know what cost and for what reason. And it is just a strategic mistake on a massive scale, particularly when you look at what's happening really in that part of the world. And you're right, Trump's looked at it, said, this is a disaster for me. Let's look what's happening with China, what happened with Taiwan. 72% of all manufactured goods are done in this side of the world. And what have you done? I would say probably one of the first major mistakes by this Labour government, and everybody then questions, do they really have the national security of our country in the forefront of the mind, instead of just signing away the rights of our country. I didn't really get why they did it I just didn't get it. David Cameron actually said no. And stopped it in its tracks. So you're right, they had been looking, it had been negotiated, but you had the ideal person. Lammy didn't even have to say it was me. He could have blamed David Cameron.
Well, it wasn't actually David Lammy, though. It was Jonathan Powell that negotiated
but, yes, but we're talking about him and whether he'll lose their job. And obviously Powell, I think, get on the plane now, isn't he? Going straight out there to try and salvage a relationship with America.
But you can't ignore the ICJ ruling, and there had to be negotiations. You couldn't just walk away from that. And when you talk about national security, within the treaty, we heard from the foreign minister that there will be a 99-year agreement over having a base there, that there won't be other countries having a base also. And these threats around China, the fact that Mauritius is more closely lined to India than...
because apparently there is a clause saying it could be 200 years, and the new Prime Minister doesn't like that.
Well, there's an opportunity for extension within the agreement, and as I say, we've got to see the detail of that agreement and when it goes towards when we see it go before obviously the Mauritius cabinet, then obviously the full treaty coming before us. So
how about the people of Chagos who didn't want it either?
Well,
we never negotiated with them. Unbelievable.
Well, there are many different communities involved in this, and we've got to recognise that. And some people do want it, some people don't want it. It's complicated because decolonisation didn't happen in the right way, but we can't change history. We've got to move forward.
The new president doesn't want it. The new prime minister, and Trump doesn't want it.
Well, I agree with Rachael in that a deal can often it has to come to Parliament as a treaty, and things can be refined. And clearly, there is still quite a lot to talk about. I think for David Lammy, clearly his relationship, his personal relationship with Donald Trump and the administration is one that we will continue to watch. But I don't think this is going to be, even if this deal falls apart, I don't think that is going to be the end of the Foreign Secretary. It's quite early on in the administration. Obviously, we know that international issues are so important in this Labour government. There are so many shifting sands in terms of alliances and where the Labour government will have to look to shore up deals. And I think, even if the deal were to fall through or they would need to edit or amend it, I don't think that is part of diplomacy, and that is something that should be welcomed pragmatically rather than seen as a failure.
OK, well, lots more subjects to come in the next half an hour of Cross Question, but do keep your calls and messages coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
The government will review sales quotas for electric vehicles over fears the investment needed to meet them is costing jobs. It follows the announcement Vauxhall is closing its plant in Luton, putting 1,100 jobs at risk. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah the first ray of hope in the Middle East conflict. Thousands in southern Lebanon are trying to return to their homes. And a second person's been arrested following a shooting in West London, which led to an 8-year-old girl being seriously injured. A man in his 30s was also injured in North Kensington on Sunday. LBC weather, dry and cold for most tonight. Windy in the southeast this evening, but this will ease overnight, a low of -3.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Esther McVey, Rachael, Maskell, Zoë Grünewald and Sarah Southern with us answering your questions. We have an all-female panel. I'm the token male on it today. There's always... People never comment when you have an all-female panel nowadays, but if you have an all-male panel, they really do. Do you think we should get over that now and just accept that sometimes it might be all-male, sometimes it might be all-female?
Why don't you do it on International Men's Day, which I think is the 19th of November? So you're going to have to wait 12 months to do it again.
No, I'm with you. It shouldn't matter. If you've got a well-balanced panel with different views and opinions, why should it matter?
I agree. Right, let's go to
you can keep your shop.
a WhatsApp question from Robbie in Chelmsford. Parliament voted by a huge majority to ban smoking for future generations because it's the cause of so many slow and painful deaths. Why can't MPs get behind the idea of generalising that freedom from suffering by backing the assisted dying bill? Rachael.
Well, freedom from suffering is something we all want to see, and I think it's the one thing that really has brought the debate around assisted dying to the fore, and particularly when we know that 100,000 people can't access palliative care across our country. Many communities don't have hospices, and for those that do receive palliative care, it's often very late in the day, and those interventions obviously make a real difference to people. But if they don't receive them, then they can be in pain, as we've been hearing, or indeed struggling with their symptoms. So the first thing that we need to do is to ensure that we have equity, to ensure that people can access the care they need. And I think I was discussing today with a palliative care specialist, and I said to them, the problem is we call it palliative care. If we called it palliative medicine, I wonder if it would have the same response, because it really is a specialist field of medicine. So I think we've got to have a complete review. We know there's going to be a commission coming on its way to look at palliative care, and that's going to be really important. But that should be informing the debate. And I think the thing about the debate we've got at the moment, we've only had the legislation before us for 2 weeks, and Parliament is pouring itself out over this legislation. It's virtually focused on nothing else. And MPs are going from story to story of really horrific deaths that people have experienced, where palliative care specialists are saying, well, we could have stepped in and made a difference and helped. And that's why I think we never, ever write a prescription before doing a diagnosis, and yet we've been given a prescription, it's the wrong prescription, and therefore we need to understand there isn't even an impact assessment to accompany this legislation. So we've got the words in the clauses to look at.
Allowance, eh?
Well, we haven't resolved that.
Actually, in case you don't know, Rachael has been a leading Labour rebel. Oh, in fact, you've led the revolt on the winter fuel allowance, haven't you?
Well, I've worried about people struggling there as well. But I think what I can say on this is that we know that we have got to improve that care for people across the board. But I'm really worried about the bill too. The safeguards just simply won't hold. We've heard that from justices looking at the judicial process, but also from consultants. And the thing that I'm particularly concerned about is coercion, because whilst there may be some malign coercion, and we know that happens across our society, we think about relationships and coercion in relationships. Often it's years before somebody realises that they were coerced in that situation. They may not got the chance here because they may have ended their life. And I think particularly as a clinician, when I worked with people and they were very sick, people would come to me and say, my patients, it's like, I don't want to be a burden on someone, or because social care is so expensive, they didn't really want to go into a care home or to pay for care at home, but maybe the grandchildren can get the money, and therefore talking themselves that intrinsic coercion. I'm really, really worried about it, and the bill just does not provide safeguards to that. You may see a consultant you don't know for one consultation, and before you know it, you're signing forms.
Okay. Sorry.
Rachael spoke really well about that, and I think this is something that, it's actually one of those issues where I thought I really strongly was on the side of, I thought we should legalise assisted dying, and the more I've heard about it, and more I heard those persuasive arguments about, is the NHS in the right state to provide the care people need? Is social care in the right state? Does the bill have the safeguards in place to prevent coercion? I just don't know, and I think it's sort of two issues of timing. The first is, has the bill had enough time and enough scrutiny that it needs for such a serious issue? And the other issue of timing is, is it the right time to introduce a bill like this when the NHS is at the forefront of everybody's mind? And what we know is that it just doesn't have the funding in place to give people palliative care, all the care they need, or have doctors make these decisions.
2 points there. The second reading is just on the principle of the bill. It's not meant to look at the details. That comes at the committee stage, and the government could presumably, if it goes through on Friday, adopt it and give a lot of time to a committee stage on the floor of the House if it chose to do so. And on the cost side, I think it's been estimated that there are probably about 1,000 people a year decide to do this. Well, I mean, that would be a pinprick in the NHS budget.
Yeah, it's not so much cost in that sense. I more mean, is the NHS in a position where people feel like they are getting the care they need if they have a terminal illness or they are suffering with immense pain? And I think if you don't have that option where everybody is getting that care, can people make those decisions, really with all the will and consent?
So if you were an MP, you would be voting against?
I think my position would be I would be voting against, but I would like to revisit this bill in the future.
2-0, Esther?
Do you want me to tell me which way I'm voting, or do you want me to give an explanation first? I'll do both.
I'll answer Robbie's question.
If we go a little bit back to the process that Rachael was talking about, this is being brought in as a sort of backbench bill, which means it will be heard on Friday. Most MPs won't be there on Friday because it is the surgery day. So it is, I think, bypassing a heck of a lot of scrutiny. I also don't agree with the rush to bring this legislation in. As Rachael said, we only had 2 weeks, not very long to look at it. A lot of MPs are brand new on all sides of the House. A lot of them really haven't got their feet under the table, don't really know what they can do, what they can't do, haven't really chatted things through. So again, a bit like the Chagos Islands, a race there to sign an agreement. I feel we're racing to do this. So for lots of reasons, just within the process alone, I don't agree with it, because I do think the government is trying to remove a lot of scrutiny. And if it were that important for the government, it should actually come forward as a government bill. I truly believe that. And I do think it's too important. It's a change in the law. It's a change in the sanctity of life. It's, as you talked about, people feeling a burden. And it is really, we should be saying, yes, we're going to take the suffering away and pain away. But we do that through palliative medicine. I like your terminology there. Do it through palliative medicine and through medicine. But you should not be making that choice and feel pressurised to make a choice. And the other thing, I think you might solve some problems, but trust me, you're introducing a whole new set of problems into this area. So I'm voting against. You wants to know, yes.
So, Southern, are you going to be the rebel?
Well, I do think if you've had a good life, you want to have a good death and you want to have some level of control over it. So I would vote in favour of it. I've always thought that we should have some form of assisted dying or euthanasia in this country. I'm pleased that this debate has got to where it is in Parliament. I am disappointed that it's obviously come through a private member's bill rather than put forward by the government. And I have listened.
But if you look back at all of the progressive social legislation in the 1960s, I mean, the Roy Jenkins, as Home Secretary, gets all the credit or debit for that, depending on your point of view. But actually, on each occasion, I think I'm right, it was a backbencher that brought in the bill, and then the government sort of adopted it, and that's how it got through. So this is not that unusual.
True. But I'm pleased that it is being debated in the way that it is. But I think it probably won't pass, and I think that will be disappointing because I think it will shelve it for quite some time. I know certainly if I was thinking about how I would like my life to end, I don't want it to be in pain and suffering. I want to be able to stop that, or indeed any of my family members.
But what about Rachel's argument about palliative care?
Yes, I think if people had a better understanding of palliative care isn't something that you know about until someone in your family experiences it. And I think palliative care, in terms of the end of life that people have, it's not something that you understand until you're experiencing it. So I think if there was a better understanding by the public as to what that truly is, I think people may feel differently. I know certainly in my family, certainly when we've used palliative care, it's eased the suffering, and that has been helpful to your emotional end of someone's life. But I think I'm still very much on the side of this bill.
One of the things that I've noticed over the last few weeks talking about this is that particularly people who are on your side of the argument, they often quote experiences that people they know or people in their families or friends who would have wanted to have availed themselves of this opportunity, I suppose you can call it. Is it dangerous to judge things by your own anecdotal experiences?
We do that with every element of our life, don't we? That's why we all have different views on things, because we've had different experiences. I feel as though when I was a child, I thought that euthanasia seemed like a good idea. So I feel as though it's something that I've cared about for a long while. But of course, when you look at family and friends who've suffered difficult, complex diseases and had painful deaths, you don't want to see them suffer, and you know that they don't want to have that suffering either. So I can understand why people have made the decision to go across to Switzerland and go to Dignitas. I can understand why people have had to have those difficult discussions in their family and come to that choice. But it is a very difficult thing for people to make their decision on as to whether they're going to support it or not. So I feel the difficulty that the MPs have on this free vote.
There is also the argument that this should be a UK-wide piece of legislation, because apparently this will only be for England and Wales. So, let's say it goes through, you could then have a lot of people in Scotland thinking, well, I want to avail myself of this, and thinking, well, I'll do it on the English NHS. And I'm sure there'll be rules about, well, you have to live in England for a year or 2 years or whatever. But it makes a fool of devolution, I think.
Well, first of all, Scotland is looking at this issue, so it has its own processes in place, but also it's because of the shape of the justice system and, of course, the health systems which are involved as well. So devolution has determined that it isn't a UK-wide approach. But I think what's really interesting, different jurisdictions, they're doing a lot more consensus building. And I think the problem about this, as we've heard, there's lots of kind of grey areas in between, and this is almost like the most extreme. And I think when we talk about debating the bill on Friday and the principle, the principle of assisted suicide is not up for debate. It is the contents of the bill. And when you go through the clauses and you see the lack of safeguards within the legislation, that's really what sets the hairs running. And my concern is there's so many MPs that are still saying, I haven't read the bill. And I really do urge colleagues to do that.
Tomorrow on the programme, we're going to devote the whole 3 hours in the programme to this debate, because it's been debated for 5 hours in Parliament on Friday. So we thought, well, the least we could do is debate it for 3 hours on this programme. So I'm rather looking forward to that. More of your calls to come, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:45.
LB.
Today.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
performances from these private providers.
It's 8:47 on LBC. Esther McVey, Rachael, Maskell, Zoë Grünewald and Sarah Southern with us answering your calls. A text question here from Bill. Very short one. It's only 5 words. Is Kemi Badenoch any good? Esther McVey.
Yes, of course she is.
Did you vote for her?
I didn't actually, no. I supported Robert Jenrick. But if I'm being honest, I think towards the final 2 were the right 2 in the final 2, and I was happy with either one. I think she's got her own unique way of doing things. She raises the pertinent topics in Prime Minister's questions, and she's fearless, and she's got a long time, a couple of years, to get even better, but she'll certainly be...
But she hasn't been very good at PMQs so far, has she?
Do you not think? I think she's been...
That's what people are saying.
I think as members of the public, when you, and most people, I think, get it afterwards, not that half an hour, and read the points that she's raised, whether it's sort of, Rachel Reeves' CV, whether it's the budget, whether it's farming, winter fuel, she's raising those pertinent points. And like I said, she'll find a feat. She's only done 3, hasn't she?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Rachel.
Well, she's very good for the Labour Party, I have to say, because I think what it's showing is that we've got a really clear offer for the country, and she's trying and trying and trying to penetrate it, and she is just not being heard. And I think people are saying Kemi who rather than really seeing her coming to the fore. And I think, obviously I do acknowledge she has broken some glass ceilings and she is new in post, and that is to welcome her to her place and to her position. But I think ultimately that against the titan of what Labour is now in Parliament, that actually she just is not rising to the level of that kind of statesperson as leader of the opposition. We haven't seen it yet. Let's wait and see over the times. But while she does, we're going to get on with the process of government.
And a 3 million petition wanting you gone.
Well, we can talk about who's signing that petition as well.
Right.
The public.
Sarah.
Yeah. Well, as a member of the Conservative Party, what I'd like to see from Kemi Badenoch...
Did you vote for her?
I did. I was going to abstain, and then in the final moments I thought, I have to vote. You've got to be part of the process. But I would like to see her put the Conservative Party back at the campaigning force that it used to be. I feel as though that has been lost, as was proven by the election back in July. I have optimism that because obviously she was involved in local politics, she was a London Assembly member, she understands campaigning on the ground, and that she'll turn CCHQ back into the force that it used to be. So that's what I would like to see as a member. But she's a month into the job. I'm very much kind of report card waiting to be written.
Zoe.
Well, I'm not a massive fan of Kemi Badenoch's politics, but to be slightly fair on her, I think anybody who became Tory leader would have a massive job on their hands, a very difficult one. I think fundamentally the Conservative Party is incredibly divided. We saw that in the last couple of years. They couldn't agree on anything. And I actually think the key issues that she's focusing on, for example, immigration, is one that, if you look at the ECHR, that's one that could potentially break the Tory party in two. I think, I don't see Kemi Badenoch lasting to be the leader at the next general election. I suspect the party will go back towards James Cleverly. I think that she is not going to be able... She doesn't have what it takes to unite that party. I don't know if James Cleverly does either, to be honest, but I think ultimately, you saw it in PMQs today. She likes to point out the issues, but she doesn't offer any solutions. And it's very easy for Keir Starmer to turn around and say, well, a lot of those issues were your making. They were part and parcel of what the last government handed down to us. So unless she massively improves, I don't think she's going to turn the Conservatives' fortunes around.
She had quite a good joke today, though, didn't she, about the McVitie's thing, where she was accusing Keir Starmer of hobnobbing with world leaders and Angela Rayner being something like the ginger nut or something, which one or two ginger people have got very offended by.
Yes, but I'm afraid that's not enough to return the support to the Conservative Party. One good joke is fine, but
the thing is, and people haven't noticed this, I'm sure you have, Sarah, that they've changed the leadership election rules. So instead of having 15% of the parliamentary party signing letters, it has to be 30% now. Now, I think that is hugely significant and ought to give her confidence that she would be there for the long term. And don't you think, Zoe, that frankly nobody wants to hear about Tory new policies nowadays? They've got a year, 18 months to work those out.
But if you don't have new policies, why on earth would anybody return their vote to you? There's no good pointing at everything that's going wrong and say, oh, everything's going wrong. They were in power for 14 years.
Sure.
So many of the issues are a result of that 14 years.
But they've surely got to, first of all, establish why it all went wrong for them, acknowledge that, in some cases maybe apologise for things that they got wrong, and then start to build for the future. If you start coming out with a shoal of new policies now, who's going to be interested?
But I don't think they're going to be able to find policies that they can all agree on, because I don't think they have shared values across the party anymore.
Well, we only need to look at yesterday's vote. Yeah, I mean, yesterday there was a very important vote on public health, and we had Conservatives in both lobbies, and I think that's a real classic example.
It's a free vote. So it's a free vote. That doesn't matter. No, I think what you will see,
actually, a free vote?
The party is galvanising around Kemi. Actually, they're also galvanising around the fact that Labour is doing such an awful job, and it basically, people are saying it lied to the electorate. They didn't realise. The petition is not about having a general election. It's saying you promised one thing, you're doing another. You've alienated, whether it's the elderly with the winter fuel payment, business with the budget, young people about student fees, you name it, farmers, you name it. Labour has managed in 100+ days to alienate everybody. And actually, the public is galvanising around the Tory party, and the Tory party will shape itself around Kemi. And as you're talking about splits, there's splits in every party. So if you look at ours, absolutely there is. We've always said, nobody hates the expression a broad church, but it's not a cathedral. But Labour Party has, whether it's the Starmerites, whether it's the Blairites, whether it's the Raynerites, the trade union people, whether it's the Corbynistas, they all have their own little factions. But I think you'll see, as we did, a big majority can actually be big rebellions, and the trouble will probably start within the Labour Party, and those will be the people who will bring Starmer down, and I think he'll be gone.
Loving how you put the question back on the Labour Party when it was all about Kemi. Right, let's move on to...
I was answering a question.
I know. Let's move on to Daniel in Warrington. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Ian, and hello, panel. My question is that given recent reports of abuse of autistic children at specialist schools, I wanted to know what the panel's thoughts are of the current SEND provision in the country and what they believe needs to be done to improve this in future.
So for those who don't know, SEND, special educational needs. Now, footage has emerged showing autistic children at Whitefield School in Brent Cross being shoved into padded rooms, thrown to the floor, or left sitting in their own vomit. The Prime Minister's spokesman says the abuse is horrendous and must never happen again, while the Children's Commissioner has called for an immediate review of the use of restraint by schools. Rachael, what's your view on that? I mean, it sounds a horrific situation, but maybe we can't really comment on that particular situation. But special educational needs education, whenever we do a phone-in on it, the lines go mad. I mean, it really is a big issue.
It's a big issue in my constituency as well, and right across the country, because we know the provision isn't there for so many children experiencing challenges. I mean, this is absolutely horrendous hearing what's happening at this school, but we know that a lot of provision has moved from the state sector into the private sector as well. Very expensive for local authorities, that we know that many children are just not able to access education at all because we don't have that diversity of an offer, and we know that parents are really struggling in the system as well. And that's why we've got to rebuild that from the kind of the start, and Bridget Phillipson has absolutely committed to doing that. We've got too many children as well who are not in education at all because they literally cannot have the provision and the support that they need. Many parents are sending their children to independent provision because there isn't anything in the state. It's been completely hollowed out, underfunded, and for too long these children have been failed, and we're failing in our obligations around ensuring not only children have access to education but equality, and also having the healthcare which many of these children need. But these kind of situations I think we can only describe as abuse.
We haven't got much time left, so 45 seconds, 1 minute each if we can. Zoe.
Well, I think Rachel's absolutely right, and I think part of the problem is this hollowing out of funding of local authorities, but also this sense that actually when you take away that provision from the state sector, what you have left is often people working for very low wages. You have poor provision, you don't have students properly looked after, you have too many students, for example, in one classroom. All these issues that massively damage the quality of care. This is a particularly obscene example, and obviously it's right that the the Children's Commissioner and probably the Care Quality Commission as well will look into it. But, you know, when you allow, you know, when you create a system where children with, you know, special educational needs and disabilities aren't being looked after, we know that these childhood experiences have a massive adverse effects on their, you know, on what happens to them later in life. And it's absolutely imperative that this Labour government look at education and young people and start there, put the funding there, look after them there.
Sarah?
I think we know that obviously there's not enough schools to send these kids to, and often that parents who choose to put their kids into an independent send school, it's not in their local area. So it's not just the fact that they're having to pay a huge chunk of money for their kids' education, they're also having to shuttle them halfway across the town or city that they live in order to get that. I know there was big concern about the VAT being added on to private schools, that it might end up being too much money for people who have kids that have SEND requirements. So I do think it is something that needs to be looked at, because these are people who really need as much educational support as they can get, because it will fulfil in many ways.
Several people on the text are saying this school is in Walthamstow, not Brent Cross, but whichever it is, it's still horrific. Esther?
Whichever adults, whoever were doing that to the children, they should have the book thrown at them. That is an absolute disgrace, and you shouldn't be choosing anybody like that. The SEND provision was always under stress, and we know since lockdown it's actually gone through the roof. What we did there to young children is now coming back to haunt us. And you are right, again, rush through VAT on private schools, another impact assessment not done there about what was going to be the impact for SEND as well. But it is a growing issue. It is an issue that we're going to have to tackle.
Right, our fun question from Oscar in Sevenoaks. The Savoy is auctioning off artefacts ahead of a major refurb, with luxury pieces of furniture, portraits of famous past guests like Charlie Chaplin, and even an historic opera score. But rather than buying bits of the Savoy, which famous hotel or stately home would you most like to move into? Rachael?
Well, I don't think it's a stately home, but in York we've got the Mansion House, which is a beautiful house in the middle of the city, home of the Lord Mayor. But I would move into that and then open it up for the city to, and particularly those people which don't have a home at the moment, and ensure that they can access good accommodation.
Tell you what, you have one of my favourite hotels in York as well, the Principal.
Okay, next to the
one of the best hotels I've ever stayed in. So I always like coming to York, because I was trying to get put up there when I come to the literary festival. Zoe?
I'll stay in the Principal. That sounded really nice. You sold that to me. I don't have a favourite hotel or stately home. Apologies. So the Principal sounds good. I'll stay there.
You need to be a member of the National Trust and start visiting.
I can do that. That's fine. I'll do that. If it gets me to the Principal, that's fine.
Okay, Esther?
What about the Ritz, the Thatcher room? Let's get in there. But to be fair, Tatton has lots of stately homes. So I'm spoilt for choice. Tatton Hall, Arley Hall. So yes, any one of those. I don't care. So long as I'm not washing the sheets, doing the cleaning, I can stay anywhere.
It's great when you think, I'd love to have a home with like 15 bedrooms. Then you think about all of that.
I was just thinking the one room. Yeah, that's why I think the hotel is the better option. And then you get everything done for you.
Sarah?
I'm just going to stay at the Premier Inn. The beds are comfy, the TVs always work, and then I can feast like a king on that all-you-can-eat breakfast.
Yeah, shall I let you into a secret? I actually bought a Premier Inn bed.
Oh,
you can
that's
do
what
that.
That's what I sleep in every night.
The mattresses are a British.
They are fantastic. And I can also recommend the pillows at the Pullman Hotel in Liverpool, because they're like really hard.
So you're the one who's been taking all of it.
No, I haven't. No,
the pillows,
I said to them,
the towels.
Where do I get them from? And she said, you can buy them from a website in France, and they're £190 each. Don't think so.
Thank you. Take it. So thank you.
No, I didn't. I did not do that. I wish to make very clear. Thank you very much to all of you. Monday's panel includes the Daily Express Associate Editor Sam Lister, Labour MP Mark Ferguson, and the Liberal Democrat Party